In the mid-1990s, women began disappearing in a quiet Siberian city. Most of them vanished at night. Some were last seen getting into a police car. The driver wore a uniform. He spoke calmly. He offered help. They trusted him. For years, the cases remained separate. There was no public warning, no official connection, and no serial killer. At least, not officially, because the man responsible was a police officer. The crimes took place in the 1990s and early 2000s. The Soviet Union had collapsed only a few years earlier. Russia was going through a period of instability. Crime rates were rising across the country. Police departments were understaffed. Resources were limited. Most investigations were handled locally. There was no national digital database, no unified tracking system. Case files were stored on paper. If patterns existed across years or districts, they were easy to miss. Angarsk was a small industrial city in Siberia. It was not known for violent crime. It was quiet, cold, isolated. When women disappeared, the cases did not immediately raise alarm. Some victims were considered socially vulnerable. Their disappearances did not always trigger urgent investigations. At first, there was no reason to suspect a serial offender. At least, not officially. The first confirmed murders took place in the mid-1990s. The victims were women. Most were between their 20s and 40s. Many had been drinking that evening. They were walking alone. Some were returning home from bars. Others were simply trying to get home safely in freezing weather. Witnesses later described a similar scene. A police car pulling up slowly. An officer offering assistance. In the 1990s, refusing a police officer was uncommon. The uniform still carried authority. Getting into the vehicle felt safer than walking alone at night. That trust was the key. The pattern was simple. He targeted women who were isolated. He identified himself as an officer. He asked routine questions. Where are you going? Have you been drinking? He sounded professional, calm, controlled. Once inside the car, the women lost control of the situation. They were driven outside the city, to empty roads, to wooded areas, to places far from witnesses. The bodies were later discovered in remote locations. The circumstances were similar, but the cases were handled separately. Different districts, different investigators, no immediate connection. As the years passed, the number of victims grew. The disappearances did not stop. They became more frequent. Still, there was no public warning, no official statement suggesting a serial offender. The pattern was there. Night, uniform, car, isolation, but it remained unseen or unacknowledged. For nearly 2 decades, the killings continued. Mikhail Popkov was not an outsider. He was a police officer. He served in the local department in Angarsk. He wore the uniform daily. He carried authority. He conducted patrols. He stopped vehicles. He questioned citizens. To colleagues, he appeared disciplined, reliable, quiet. He had a family. Neighbors described him as ordinary. Nothing about his appearance suggested violence. There were no public suspicions, no formal complaints linking him to disappearances. In fact, he sometimes participated in investigations. He discussed cases with other officers. He followed reports about missing women. He knew how the system worked. He understood its gaps. He knew which roads were poorly monitored. He knew how files were stored. He knew how long investigations typically lasted. The badge did more than provide authority. It provided protection. A police vehicle was rarely questioned. A uniform was rarely challenged. The trust placed in law enforcement became his most effective tool. For years, he continued his duties during the day and committed murders at night. The two lives did not appear to intersect until they did. For years, the investigation remained stagnant. The murders continued without a clear suspect, and the evidence remained fragmented across different jurisdictions. Case files were buried in local archives, stored on paper, separated by district boundaries, without a centralized digital system. The connection between the disappearances remained purely circumstantial. Investigators could see individual crimes, but the larger pattern was still hidden. In the early 2000s, a specialized federal task force was formed to review cold cases from the previous decade. At the same time, forensic science had begun to change. DNA testing methods had advanced significantly. New techniques in molecular genetics allowed investigators to extract viable genetic profiles from biological samples that had been stored for more than 10 years. Evidence that once seemed unusable could now be tested again. A full re-examination of the evidence was launched. Biological material collected from multiple crime scenes was processed again and entered into a growing national DNA database. This time, the results were definitive. The same genetic profile began to appear across multiple murder investigations. One by one, separate cases became connected. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. With the cases now linked, investigators began narrowing the list of potential suspects. They focused on individuals who had access to vehicles, individuals who moved freely during late-night hours, individuals who were familiar with police procedures and investigative routines. To test the theory, investigators initiated a massive screening operation. A large-scale DNA collection campaign was conducted among current and former law enforcement personnel. More than 3,500 officers were tested, as duty logs, patrol schedules, and vehicle records were cross-referenced. One name appeared repeatedly: Mikhail Popkov. Analysis showed that he had been on duty during several of the nights connected to the murders. He had knowledge of the ongoing investigations, and most importantly, he had operated from within the very system designed to stop the killer. In June 2012, Popkov was detained while traveling by train to Vladivostok. At first, suspicion within the department seemed difficult to accept. He was one of their own, a police officer who had served for years. When confronted, he denied everything. But the DNA evidence was decisive. Laboratory analysis confirmed the match between his genetic profile and the biological samples recovered from multiple crime scenes. The probability of coincidence was virtually impossible. When the laboratory results were presented, the denials began to weaken. The interrogation process slowly shifted. Resistance gave way to hesitation. Hesitation eventually turned into admission. Popkov began to speak. Not about one murder, not about 5. As the investigation expanded, the scale of his crimes became clear. Investigators uncovered dozens of victims, revealing a 2-decade history of violence, hidden behind the authority of a police badge. Once the confessions began, the numbers escalated fast. Dozens of murders, then more. Cold cases reopened across the Irkutsk region. Files that had collected dust for years suddenly had a suspect. Remote roads, night stops, women who believed they were being helped. The official count eventually surpassed 90 victims. Some investigators believe the true number may never be known. He became Russia's most prolific serial killer in modern history. But the number was not what shocked the country. It was how he did it. He drove marked police vehicles. He wore state-issued authority. He stopped women under the promise of protection. For nearly 2 decades, he had never been hiding. In 2015, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Additional convictions followed. Yet even after the verdict, the investigation continued. Because every new confession revealed the same uncomfortable truth. The pattern had always been there. The warning signs had always been there. The uniform had concealed everything. Not because it made him invisible, but because it made him trusted. He did not hide in darkness. He worked regular shifts. He wore the uniform. He carried a service weapon. He filed reports. He attended briefings. For years, investigators searched for a predator moving through the city at night. They did not imagine that he returned to the same building each morning. The system that granted him authority also shielded him from suspicion. Not because he was invisible, because he was trusted. A marked vehicle was rarely questioned. A badge was rarely doubted. A uniform was rarely challenged. For nearly 2 decades, that trust protected him. Dozens of women never came home. Their cases were filed, archived, reopened, connected. Too late. His name was Mikhail Popkov. And for years, the law and the killer were the same person.